Urza's block is probably the most broken block of all time. It's made up of 3 consecutively released sets that came out between 1998 and 1999, Urza's Saga, Urza's Legacy, and Urza's Destiny. These 3 sets ultimately ended up breaking every single one of Magic's formats, ushering in a miserable period in competitive Magic called Combo Winter, where every format was dominated by incredibly fast and consistent combo decks. While there are more than 24 cards in the block that had to be banned in multiple formats within the next year after being printed, the biggest offenders are probably Memory Jar, Tolarian Academy, and Yawgmoth's Will. The jar lets you draw a bunch of cards with very little downside, the Academy produces stupid amounts of mana, and Yawgmoth's Will lets you cast your entire graveyard. Even today, all 3 of those cards are only legal in Vintage, where they are restricted to 1 copy per deck. If you're interested on a deeper dive on just how broken decks were during Combo Winter, I have done videos on Memory Jar and Tolarian Academy decks from that era. In short, Urza's block is filled with busted and incredibly pushed cards. However, that doesn't mean every card in the block is amazing, and that's what we'll be focusing on in this video. 10 cards from Urza's block that aren't fit to be played and have never been fit to be played in 40 card, 60 card, or 100 card formats. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. At number 10, it's Viashino Weaponsmith. For 3 generic and a red, it's a 2/2, and if it gets blocked, it gets +2/+2 until end of turn. The base stat line is horrendous, even for the late 1990s, but the ability does grant some pseudo-evasion, since a creature needs 5 toughness to be able to block it and survive. The problem is blocking the Weaponsmith isn't going to exactly be a priority, since, it's a 2/2, and it's a massive liability anytime it isn't attacking, since it can't block very much effectively, and it dies to many 1-mana removal spells. Basically, the ceiling here is that it's sort of a hard-to-block 4-mana 2/2, and that's hardly something to write home about, and it isn't even quite that good. At number 9, I've got Electrite. For 3 generic and 2 red, it's a 3/3, and when it deals combat damage to a defending player, it deals damage equal to its power to each blocking creature. Like the Weaponsmith, this is a severely understated creature, but it's actually even easier to block since it's just a 3/3 when it gets blocked. Now, that ability is upside, and it's easy to imagine Electrite getting in for a hit and killing some stuff, but there are some serious problems with actually making that happen. One of them is that your 5-mana 3/3 is basically never going to get in for a hit to begin with, and if your opponent can block, they'll just block the Electrite. They aren't ever going to block your other stuff and let the Electrite through. So Electrite actually hitting your opponent and damaging some opposing blocking creatures is almost never going to come up, effectively making this a vanilla 5-mana 3/3, and that's a card you never play. At number 8, it's Hawk-Eater Moth. For 3 generic and a green, it's a 1/2 with Shroud. If you're a newer player who isn't familiar with the old Shroud mechanic, it's a keyword for the cannot be the target of spells or abilities part of this card. Basically, it's a worse version of Hexproof. This is because you can't target the Moth either, and that's a big part of what makes hexproof creatures good, being able to put auras and counters on them and stuff, but you can't do that here. You can use mass pump effects and the like, but that's way too narrow when the floor on a card is that it's a 4-mana 1/2 flyer that isn't the least bit threatening. At number 7, I've got both Jasmine Seer and Ivy Seer. They're both part of a cycle of 5 bad cards from Urza's Destiny. All of them are 4-mana 1/1s. We've seen some bad stat lines already, but that one is by far the worst. They do all have activated abilities, and they all cost 2 generic and 1 colored mana, and require you to reveal cards of a particular color from your hand to do something. While I think the other 3 Seers are bad, I don't think they quite deserve to be on the list like Jasmine and Ivy Seer do. After all, the red and black ones have a repeatable removal effect, and Brine Seer is a repeatable counterspell. Meanwhile, Ivy Seer is a buff effect, and Jasmine Seer gains you life. Those aren't nearly as good when they're repeatable, since they don't generally generate a card worth the value like the other 3 Seers can. If your game plan is to spend 4 mana on a woefully inefficient creature that basically can never block or attack effectively, and then sink 3 mana at a time into them while showing your opponent what's going on in your hand for meager effects, you're just gonna lose. For Ivy Seer, part of what makes tricks good is the surprise factor, but if your opponent is well aware you can use it, that upside is negated, and the pure life gain on Jasmine Seer isn't worth it in most games, especially when it costs this much mana. That's without really talking about the fact that one frequently doesn't have enough cards to reveal for these abilities to be relevant in the first place. It's a big shame that these have such awful stat lines and mediocre activated abilities, because the design of the cycle is kind of cool, but they just underpowered it in the end. At number 6, it's Reclusive White. By far the most efficient creature we've seen so far. The white is 3 generic and a black for a 4/4. Talk about a world beater. Except that it has an absolutely abysmal downside. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you control another non-land permanent, you sacrifice the white. In other words, if you got anything but a land on the battlefield, the white gets sacrificed to your next upkeep, and chances are really, really good that you've got, other stuff going on. You might say, well, I could build around it and just not run any other non-land permanents, and to that I say, go for it, I guess. You won't be winning any games with that style of deck since you're making a huge deck building concession, and the upside of the white is just that it's a 4 mana 4/4, and that itself is not exactly a creature that can close out the game. Now, it is true this card was a little bit better back in the late 1990s since creatures were less efficient across the board, but it was still horrible back then for all the reasons it's still horrible today. We've seen some truly terrible cards so far, but the top half of the list is, obviously enough, even worse. That's because most of them do nothing or very, very little for what they cost. At least the cards on the bottom half of this list, terrible as they are, do something simply by virtue of being creatures who can attack and block. That's not so true about the top half of this list. At number 5, it's Lurking Jackals. For 1 black mana, it's an enchantment, and whenever an opponent has 10 or less life, if Lurking Jackals is an enchantment, it becomes a 3/2 jackal creature. It's often forgotten that Urza's block was actually designed as an enchantment block. This is easily forgotten because many of the block's most broken cards are actually artifacts or artifact payoffs, but Lurking Jackals is part of a huge cycle of cards from Urza's block, all of which start out as do-nothing enchantments, but when some condition happens, they become creatures. The design is actually pretty cool, but most of them are bad, because being a do-nothing enchantment up front is pretty darn rough, even if the creature you eventually get is kind of efficient. And I think Lurking Jackals is the worst of this cycle. Part of the problem for the Jackals is that if you're playing this thing out, you're hurting your chances of actually achieving what it wants you to, since playing a card that does nothing really hurts your chances of lowering your opponent's life to 10 or less. Furthermore, even if you do get this 3/2, by the time you do, it's not going to feel that special, since it's not particularly big or impressive on most boards when your opponent is at 10 or less life. And if you end up behind at all in a game, it will feel particularly horrendous, since it will never do anything. So, the idea is cool, but the execution is awful. At number 4, it's Greener Pastures. For 2 generic and a green, it's an enchantment, and during each player's upkeep, if that player controls more lands than each other player, that player creates a 1/1 green sapperling creature token. Alright, so this can actually affect the board, but oftentimes not in your favor. This is because the effect is symmetrical, and every player gets to reap the benefits of the pastures. And that's especially bad because you were the one who spent mana and used up a card on the effect, so your opponents get the sapperlings effectively for free, while you actually paid for them. That means even getting one of them puts them way ahead, and also means you're going to need to get a ton of sapperlings out of this thing to feel like you're even breaking even, and that's tough to do, since the most it's ever going to do is give you 1 sapperling at a time. Now, you could build a lands matter deck where you generally always have more lands than your opponents, but even in that style of deck, there will be times where you just can't cast this because your opponents have more lands than you do, and even if this was a card that only ever gave you a sapperling on your turn, it would still be pretty bad. So warping a deck around playing this really isn't worth it. At number 3, it's Purging Scythe. As I mentioned, Urza's block is famous for having lots of busted artifacts, but Purging Scythe isn't one of them. It's one of the worst artifacts ever. It must be tough having so many famous and successful siblings. Anyway, it's 5 generic, and at the beginning of your upkeep, it does 2 damage to the creature with the least toughness. And if 2 or more creatures are tied, you choose the one that gets damaged. So, this is another card that you sink mana into and it doesn't impact the board right away, and 5 mana is a lot when you're not getting anything until your next upkeep. And then the thing you get on your next upkeep is pretty bad. Sure, it might let you kill an opponent's small creature every turn, but it's also symmetrical, so you have to be careful with your own creatures, and sometimes the lowest toughness creature on the board has 3 or more toughness, in which case the Scythe is once again entirely useless. Frankly, even if this did 2 damage to any target every upkeep, it wouldn't be much more than a solid card, and it's way worse than that. At number 2, it's Parasitic Bond. For 3 generic and a black, it's an aura with enchant creature, and at the beginning of the upkeep of the enchanted creature's controller, it does 2 damage to that player. So, usually, when you put an aura on an opposing creature, you're hoping that you are effectively removing it by lowering its stats, taking away its abilities, or making it so it can't attack or block. What you really don't want to do is spend 4 mana and use a card on an effect that doesn't make your opponent's creature any worse at doing any of those things, and that's exactly what we have here. If you put this on a really scary creature, guess what? It's still just as scary as it was before, you just tacked on a very minor downside. Damaging your opponent can be good, of course, but it's not an effect that's worth an entire card or 4 mana. What's worse is, if your opponent just trades away their creature, you end up getting 2 for 1, which is brutal. Playing Parasitic Bond and hoping you bleed your opponent out with it is a good way to lose a game of Magic. And at number 1, I've got Discordant Dirge. For 3 generic and 2 black, it's an enchantment, and during your upkeep, you put a verse counter on it. You can pay 1 black and sacrifice the Dirge to look at target opponent's hand and choose up to X cards from it, where X is the number of verse counters on the Dirge, and that player discards those cards. There's a whole cycle of uncommon and rare song cards that use verse counters, and most of them are pretty bad because they don't do anything up front and take a while to build up to the point where using their ability is relevant, but Discordant Dirge was the only one that I felt was bad enough to make this list, and that's because even once you do get counters on it and can actually make your opponent discard, that effect is pretty irrelevant. At least with most of the other verse counter cards, you can have a dream where you get a million counters on it and win the game with the effect, and that's just not true here. Most of the time, when you cast the Dirge, most opponents won't have a ton of cards to begin with, and you have to wait several turns for the Dirge to ever give you an effect worth using, so it's even less likely by then. Mix in the fact that spending 5 on a card that does nothing to the board is a huge liability, and that even when you do use it, it never does anything to improve your board state or weaken your opponents, and we're talking about the worst card in Urza's block. So, those are my picks for the worst cards in Urza's block. If you're looking to build an awful card cube or something, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on almost 900 other MTG top 10s, including many more that look at the worst cards in the game, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.